Everything you've ever imagined about the devil didn't come from heaven or hell. It came from Greece. From the forests. From the echo of flutes played by a horned god who once represented everything the church wanted to erase from the human soul. The image of Satan that burns in our collective mind, the horns, the hooves, the half-man, half-beast, wasn't born in the Bible. It was stolen. Hijacked. Engineered out of the body of Pan, the god of wild nature, freedom, and instinct. Pan was never evil. He was chaos, yes, raw, sexual, unpredictable, but not malevolent. In ancient Greece, he was worshipped as the spirit of the untamed world, the embodiment of vitality, of the pulse that runs through all living things. He wasn't some monster, he was the heartbeat of the earth itself. People would pray to him for fertility, for music, for courage. He was the patron of shepherds and flocks, the one who danced at the edge of civilization where nature refused to be tamed. And that's exactly why he became public enemy number one the moment Christianity began its conquest of the pagan world. The church couldn't conquer nature by killing trees. They had to conquer what people believed lived inside those trees. So they took the image of Pan, the horned god of the wild, and they twisted it into the eternal villain. They turned the god of nature into the god of damnation. Overnight, the symbol of fertility became the face of sin. The laughter of the forest turned into the shriek of hell. It was psychological warfare. A war for the imagination. Think about this, the word panicked literally comes from Pan. Ancient people said his sudden presence could make soldiers flee, animals stampede, and crowds lose control. Panic meant a divine surge of energy, too much truth for the human nervous system. The church took that same feeling of wild ecstasy and labeled it demonic possession. The ecstasy of nature was recoded as evil hysteria. The same vibrations that made humans feel alive were now described as gateways to hell. When Christianity became the state religion of Rome, the operation went full throttle. Pagan gods weren't just replaced, they were criminalized. Statues were defaced. Shrines were burned. Every horned deity, Pan, Faunus, Cernunnos, was lumped together under a single, monstrous caricature. The devil. The church needed an enemy that looked the part, and Pan's image was perfect: horns, goat legs, a grin that hinted at forbidden pleasure. Everything the church feared about human desire could now be projected onto one visual target. And the timing couldn't be more convenient. The Roman Empire was collapsing. Society was fractured. Fear was currency. If you wanted control, you needed a monster big enough to terrify people into obedience. Enter the devil, the recycled god of the countryside, repackaged as the destroyer of souls. It wasn't theology, it was propaganda. Let's get real, there's not a single verse in the Old Testament that describes Satan looking like that. No horns. No tail. No pitchfork. Those details appear centuries later in Christian art, long after the empire absorbed Greek culture. Artists borrowed the familiar iconography of Pan because it already had a powerful psychological charge. People recognized that silhouette, the goat man, the symbol of forbidden ecstasy, and the church weaponized it. The face that once inspired fertility rituals now haunted nightmares. Why? Because Pan represented something the new religion couldn't control: ecstasy without permission. In the world of the church, joy had to be mediated through doctrine, through ritual, through hierarchy. But Pan didn't ask for priests. He didn't need a temple. His worship was primal, spontaneous, intimate. You didn't pray to Pan, you joined him. That terrified the theologians. They couldn't tolerate a god that connected man directly to nature, bypassing the institution. So they labeled that connection heresy, sin, temptation. It gets darker. In medieval Europe, when witch hunts spread like wildfire, the confessions extracted under torture repeated the same imagery: horns, cloven feet, wild dances, animal sacrifice. What the inquisitors called sabbats were in fact fragments of older fertility festivals that never died. The so-called witches weren't worshipping Satan, they were holding on to the last threads of pre-Christian nature religion. But under church interrogation, every trace of Pan's worship was rebranded as satanic debauchery. They erased him from the pantheon and forced his followers into the shadows. That's how psychological rewriting works. First, you kill the god, then, you make people afraid to even remember him. By the 15th century, the visual grammar was complete. The devil had goat legs, horns, and a predatory smile. The church had successfully merged the horned fertility gods with the concept of cosmic evil. Every trace of nature's sacred power was now inverted into a warning sign. Sexuality became shame. Instinct became sin. The wilderness became a metaphor for moral danger. And here's the most twisted part: the church didn't just demonize Pan, they absorbed him. Medieval monasteries carved horned demons onto cathedral walls, not to celebrate him but to remind people what awaited them if they strayed from obedience. Fear replaced connection. Control replaced communion. The human psyche was rewired to flinch at the very symbols that once represented vitality and joy. This is why the devil looks like a Greek god. Because he was one. The image of Satan we know today, half man, half beast, crowned with horns, is the ghost of Pan wearing chains. The horns of freedom became the horns of damnation. The smile of ecstasy turned into the sneer of corruption. The church didn't destroy Pan, it rebranded him into an eternal scapegoat to keep humanity afraid of its own nature. Let's tear open the next lie, the one printed right in your Bible, translated, twisted, and sold as gospel. The name Lucifer. The so-called fallen angel, the cosmic traitor, the shining rebel of heaven. Guess what? That name didn't belong to the devil at all. It belonged to a planet. Venus. The morning star. The Romans used the Latin word Lucifer to describe the brilliance of dawn, the light that rises before sunrise. In Isaiah 14 verse 12, it's used as an insult, a taunt aimed at a human king, not a supernatural being. The prophet was mocking the arrogance of the Babylonian ruler who thought himself untouchable, calling him Helel ben Shakar, the morning star that would be cast down. That's it. A poetic burn, not a demonic biography. But centuries later, the church needed a backstory for evil. So they took that single verse, ripped it out of its political context, and built an entire mythology around it. They turned a metaphor about imperial pride into a cosmic rebellion. Suddenly, the word Lucifer, once a compliment meaning bringer of light, became the trademark of darkness. The irony is almost unbearable. They made the light bringer the Lord of Shadows. That's how inverted this theology became. Let's break it down. The original Hebrew text never uses the word Lucifer. It says Helel, from a root meaning to shine. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, he used the Roman word Lucifer, which was totally normal at the time. It referred to Venus in pagan astronomy. Early Christian writers even used Lucifer as a name for Christ himself in the book of Revelation, the bright morning star. That's right. The same title the church later assigned to the devil was once used for Jesus. You can't make this up. It's written right there in the texts they told you never to question. So how did the morning star get flipped into the prince of hell? Politics. Theology is never pure, it's always strategic. By the time Augustine and later medieval theologians shaped the doctrine of Satan's fall, Christianity had already absorbed layers of Greco-Roman mythology, Persian dualism, and Hebrew poetry. They fused it all into a single cosmic drama, heaven versus hell, light versus darkness, God versus Lucifer. It made for a perfect narrative, simple, dramatic, and terrifying enough to control people through fear. But it was built on mistranslation, not revelation. Lucifer's fall was never in the original text. Isaiah wasn't writing about angels waging war in heaven. He was mocking a dead king. But the church recoded it, turning political satire into cosmic warfare. Suddenly, a human ruler's arrogance became evidence of a celestial rebellion. The message shifted from "Don't get cocky, Babylon" to "Obey, or you'll burn with Lucifer." That's the birth of religious fear marketing, an empire of guilt built on a single verse. The early church fathers didn't just reinterpret scripture, they industrialized symbolism. They took Venus, the morning star that rises and falls in the sky, and dramatized it as a celestial being who fell from grace. The planet's natural motion became a moral metaphor. When Venus disappeared below the horizon, it wasn't astronomy anymore, it was the devil falling from heaven. People couldn't read, they couldn't verify. They just believed what the pulpit told them. And what they were told was this: light itself had betrayed God. And that's the punchline. They created a mythology where illumination, knowledge, curiosity, beauty became suspect. The bringer of light was the enemy. It's not just linguistic manipulation, it's psychological engineering. You train people to fear enlightenment by making its symbol evil. You turn the impulse to question into sin. That's how civilizations get domesticated, by demonizing their own intelligence. Let's talk about that war in heaven story that everyone thinks is biblical. It isn't. The idea that Lucifer led a rebellion with a third of the angels? That's not in Isaiah. It's a Frankenstein creation pieced together centuries later from the book of Revelation, which itself is a vision, an apocalypse, not a history book. The writers who stitched it together took imagery from multiple sources: Babylonian myths of divine overthrow, Greek stories of Titans versus Olympians, even Egyptian themes of cosmic order and chaos. They blended them into one cinematic myth and branded it God's truth. Lucifer became the prototype villain. But if you strip away the church gloss, he's the same archetype found in every ancient story, the bringer of knowledge who defies divine authority. Prometheus, Enki, even the serpent in Eden. Every culture has one. Every empire demonized him. So when medieval scholars painted Lucifer falling through the sky, they weren't describing theology, they were translating astronomy into propaganda. The morning star that once symbolized rebirth became the ultimate warning: don't rise above your station. Don't question the hierarchy. Don't reach for too much light. The devil's punishment was just the empire's censorship in divine disguise. By the time of Dante and Milton, the myth was solid gold. Lucifer was no longer a mistranslation, he was a brand. Paradise Lost sealed it forever: the rebellious angel, the tragic anti-hero, the one who said better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That line hit too close to home for the ruling church, but they couldn't erase it. So they did what they always do: kept the narrative but twisted the meaning. They let Lucifer exist as a warning, not a mirror. The audience was never supposed to see themselves in him. They were supposed to flinch. The genius of it all was how the church built a villain out of poetry and fear. They took one ancient metaphor for a fallen king, fused it with a pagan term for Venus, injected it with Zoroastrian dualism, and turned it into a global doctrine. Lucifer, the light-bearer, was recast as the eternal deceiver. His name went from celestial to infernal. The transition wasn't revelation, it was branding. Let's talk about what really happened when Christianity went head-to-head with the old gods. It wasn't a spiritual debate, it was an extermination campaign dressed up as salvation. When Rome turned Christian, every god, every goddess, every local spirit instantly became a threat to the monopoly. And the church didn't argue them out of existence, it legislated them out. The empire simply swapped the pantheon for one god, one book, one chain of command. The theology was the marketing, the execution was political. The easiest way to wipe out centuries of belief was to turn every rival deity into a demon. It started small, just whispers in sermons. Those idols aren't gods, they're devils pretending to be gods. Smart move, right? You don't just discredit your competition, you turn them into evil itself. Farmers who once prayed to a harvest goddess were told they were inviting demonic possession. Women who kept household shrines were told they were witches. Priests of the old temples were declared sorcerers. That's how you rewrite the human mind: you don't destroy the sacred, you rename it. Suddenly, the same rituals that fed communities for 1,000 years were labeled satanic. Overnight, devotion became crime. Picture a world where every festival, every statue, every local song is now considered dangerous. That's how it looked from the 4th century onward. Paganism wasn't defeated, it was rebranded as devil worship. When people refused to convert, the church didn't debate, they seized their temples, baptized their sacred wells, rededicated their groves, and called it progress. You can still trace it in geography, churches built right on top of shrines, saints replacing gods one by one. Saint Bridget replaces the Celtic Brigid. Saint George replaces the dragon slayers of Greece. It's not coincidence, it's colonization. The cross wasn't planted in new soil, it was driven into old altars. And here's where the genius cruelty comes in. They didn't erase the old gods entirely, they let their shadows live as monsters. You recognize the pattern: Pan becomes the devil, Artemis becomes the witch, Dionysus becomes the sin of drunkenness. Every divine archetype was kept alive just enough to terrify people. They kept the imagery because fear works better when it's familiar. When you tell a farmer that the forest god he grew up honoring is now the Prince of Darkness, you create a permanent split in the psyche. Love turns to terror, and terror is easy to control. You can see it in the language. The Greek word daimon, which originally meant spirit or divine intelligence, became demon. That single translation flipped the spiritual universe upside down. What had been a vast ecosystem of spirits became a single binary, God versus the devil. Everything else in between, nature spirits, ancestors, local protectors, was thrown into the pit. Imagine the arrogance it takes to flatten an entire cosmology into one enemy. But it worked. Fear simplified everything. When missionaries marched north into Europe, they didn't bring light, they brought fire. Every local god, from the Norse to the Slavs, was rewritten as a minion of hell. Thor's hammer became the devil's weapon. Freya's sexuality became witchcraft. The horned gods of the forests were painted on church walls as demons. They called it conversion, but it was psychological warfare. And the beauty of it was, people did half the work themselves. Once terror sets in, you don't need soldiers. The villagers start policing each other. That's how the machine sustains itself. By the Middle Ages, the church had perfected the script. Pagan holidays were replaced with holy days. Yule became Christmas. Ostara became Easter. Beltane became Walpurgis Night, the so-called witches' Sabbath. You don't delete tradition, you reprogram it. People still danced around fires, but now they were told it was a celebration of Christ, not the sun. That's how empires digest cultures, they metabolize them into obedience. The public never notices the theft, they just wake up one day praying to a new name. And it didn't stop at symbols, it went into flesh. The Inquisition turned theology into surveillance. If you were caught practicing anything remotely old, an herb ritual, a lunar chant, a fertility dance, you were accused of serving the devil. The church invented a manual for fear, signs of witchcraft, signs of possession, signs of heresy. They trained entire generations to see their neighbors as agents of evil. The priests became interrogators, and the confession booth became the first lie detector. It wasn't about souls, it was about submission. They even hijacked architecture. Cathedrals were built using the exact same sacred geometry that pagans used to align temples with stars, but the purpose flipped. Instead of tuning human energy to the cosmos, they trapped it under the vault of doctrine. Gargoyles, grotesques, and horned faces carved into stone weren't just decoration, they were reminders of the conquered gods. The church literally mounted the old pantheon onto its walls as trophies. Every monster was once a deity. Every grotesque was a warning, remember who lost. Here's the thing that hits hardest, this wasn't a spiritual evolution. It was a hostile takeover. Paganism didn't vanish because it was wrong. It was absorbed, distorted, and then outlawed to solidify power. The conversion of Europe wasn't about faith, it was about erasing memory. The church didn't fear false gods, it feared competition. A world filled with many divine voices couldn't be ruled by one throne. So they silenced the chorus and called it holiness. It began when the old temples were gutted and converted. The marble that once held statues of Dionysus, Hermes, and Artemis was reused to build churches. But those faces, those symbols, didn't vanish. They mutated. The sculptors kept the features, the flowing hair, the wings, the serpents, the horns. They just rearranged them into new moral stories. The angel with wings becomes Michael. The serpent becomes the devil. The horned god becomes the fallen one. It's not creation, it's rebranding. They recycled mythology like raw material, stripping context and pasting new meanings over old forms. You can literally see the crime scene in art history. Early Christian mosaics are filled with figures that still look Greek. The so-called angels of God are modeled after Eros, the god of love, same anatomy, same youthful beauty, same posture. The so-called demons? Those are satyrs, Pan's companions, just redrawn with uglier expressions. The visual transition was deliberate. They knew the masses couldn't read. The pictures had to teach obedience without words. Every image was a sermon in color and fear. By the medieval period, the church had turned this manipulation into psychological engineering. Artists were ordered to portray sin as disfigurement, bodies warped, teeth exposed, eyes bulging, limbs twisted. Hell wasn't metaphysical anymore, it was anatomical horror. They took the pagan fascination with the body, the naked gods, the sacred flesh, and inverted it into disgust. Every sensual curve became an accusation. You can see it in the frescoes. Eve's beauty is a trap, her gaze a curse. The human body, once divine in Greek sculpture, became a vessel of shame. The art screamed what the pulpit whispered: your instincts are demonic, your desire is dangerous, your flesh is an accomplice of hell. Take the gargoyles, those grotesque faces clinging to Gothic cathedrals. People think they were there to ward off evil. No. They are the evil, petrified on the walls. They're trophies. The architects mounted them to remind you that the church had tamed the monsters of the old world. Those stone demons are conquered gods, humiliated and frozen mid-scream. It's symbolic execution, an empire declaring victory over nature, over chaos, over freedom. Imagine walking into a church where the walls themselves glare down at you like watchdogs. That's not piety. That's psychological conditioning. And then came the manuscripts. The Illuminators who decorated holy texts didn't just write words, they coded entire hierarchies of fear. In the margins, tiny devils dance around priests, whispering into ears, clawing at souls. Every illustration was a moral leash: stay pure, or that thing will come for you. These weren't random doodles, they were state-funded propaganda campaigns. Artists were theologians with brushes. Their job wasn't to express beauty, it was to enforce doctrine. The ink was blessed, but the intention was control. Now let's talk about the inversion of symbols. The church didn't invent most of its sacred signs, it hijacked them. The halo? Pagan sun disk. The cross? Ancient solar wheel. Even the trident held by demons in medieval art, it's Poseidon's weapon, stolen and repurposed. The church took every familiar pagan emblem and weaponized it. You knew those shapes since birth, they lived in your culture, your myths. By corrupting them, the church rewired your reflexes. What once meant vitality now triggered fear. That's how you control minds without words, you teach people to flinch at their own heritage. They did it with animals too. The goat, once a sacred emblem of fertility, became Satan's mascot. The serpent, once a symbol of wisdom, was turned into the ultimate deceiver. The owl, once the bird of Athena, wisdom itself, became the witch's familiar. The entire natural world was recoded into moral allegory. Forests became haunted. Wolves became cursed. Women who healed with herbs were suddenly in league with the devil. The visual order of creation was rewritten into a moral battlefield. Look at the shift in architecture from pagan temples to Gothic cathedrals. Pagan temples were open, mathematical, geometric, a dialogue with the cosmos. Gothic cathedrals were vertical prisons of awe. They forced the gaze upward, away from earth, away from nature, toward an invisible authority. Every arch was a command: look up, submit, be small. The light filtering through stained glass wasn't to enlighten, it was to intimidate. You were bathed in colored shadows while a horned beast stared down from the carvings. That's not spirituality, or that's sensory domination. And it worked. People lived surrounded by images that told them they were watched, judged, and doomed by default. There was no escape, not in art, not in architecture, not in literature. Every visual field was colonized. The devil wasn't just in hell, he was in your walls, your ceiling, your imagination. And the church stood in the middle, claiming to hold the keys to keep him out. That's how you manufacture dependence. Create the disease, then sell the cure. Even the concept of the witch's Sabbath was visual propaganda before it was theology. Paintings from the Renaissance show women flying, animals talking, demons feasting. None of it came from eyewitness accounts, it came from inquisitors' fantasies, illustrated by court painters. The goal wasn't to depict reality, it was to mass-produce fear. People saw those images and believed the world was crawling with Satan's agents. They turned imagination into evidence. This is the real machinery of control, art as weapon. The devil's horns, the grotesques, the tortured souls, they were tools to burn obedience into the subconscious. It's not a coincidence that during the height of this imagery, literacy rates plummeted. You don't need readers when you've got stone and glass telling the story for you. The church didn't need to argue theology, it surrounded you with it every hour of your life. The demonization of the old gods wasn't just religious, it was economic, political, and psychological warfare disguised as theology. The church didn't just rewrite myths, it rewired the entire social structure around them. When a civilization converts its gods into monsters, it doesn't just change belief, it rewrites loyalty. Every time a deity was labeled demonic, a population lost its ancestral anchor and became dependent on a new authority. That's not revelation, that's asset seizure on a spiritual scale. The tactic was simple and brutal. You don't erase a culture by banning it, you make people terrified of their own memories. The church mastered that formula. It declared all rival gods to be fallen angels, all local rituals to be satanic, and all independent spirituality to be rebellion. In one stroke, every form of cultural identity outside the church became criminal. It's the same playbook empires always use: turn resistance into heresy, turn self-knowledge into sin. The brilliance lies in the efficiency. You don't need soldiers when people police themselves. Fear does the heavy lifting. Take Europe in the early medieval era. Entire nations were built on the ashes of their own myths. The church didn't just destroy temples, it replaced the social order that those temples upheld. The village priest became the new tribal elder. The confessional replaced the oracle. The tithe replaced temple offerings. It wasn't just theology, it was an economic network. Every conversion meant new taxes, new labor, new land holdings. Every soul saved was another body conscripted into a system that claimed divine monopoly. You didn't just owe the church your prayers, you owed them your productivity. And if you didn't comply, you weren't a dissenter, you were a servant of the devil. That's how moral control works. You fuse the fear of eternal damnation with the machinery of daily life. The church created a cosmic bureaucracy where sin was a crime and forgiveness was a currency. You sinned, you paid. Indulgences weren't spiritual gifts, they were invoices. The entire doctrine of the devil served one function: to justify hierarchy. If the devil was chaos, then the church was order. If the devil was rebellion, then obedience was salvation. You can't maintain feudal power without that kind of moral geometry. It wasn't just fear, it was theater. Public exorcisms, witch trials, relic parades, burnings at the stake. These weren't random acts of zealotry, they were live demonstrations of the church's monopoly on truth. Every trial was a commercial for obedience. Every execution was a sermon without words. The devil was the perfect scapegoat for any social crisis: famine, plague, crop failure, heresy. Just blame Satan, then sell the cure. The branding was airtight. What's fascinating is how consistent the pattern was. Wherever Christianity expanded, it repeated the same process: demonize the local deities, absorb their symbols, weaponize fear. In Scandinavia, Thor became a demon of thunder. In Africa, ancestral spirits were labeled witchcraft. In South America, feathered serpent gods became agents of the devil. You could draw a straight line from one continent to another, different languages, same accusation. The church built the first global fear network long before television or propaganda. The product was universal guilt. And it wasn't random who got branded demonic. The targets were always those who held power outside the system: midwives, healers, visionaries, philosophers, women with influence, men who questioned. Anyone who didn't need the priest to mediate their reality. The church couldn't allow autonomous spirituality because that threatened its monopoly. So it didn't just create a devil, it created a demographic to attach him to. Witchcraft, heresy, rebellion, they all became synonyms for independence. Every burned witch was a political message: autonomy equals evil. The devil was the brand logo of control. The propaganda was self-reinforcing. The more the church demonized opposition, the more people internalized fear, and the easier it became to label dissent. It's genius: if you control the definition of evil, you control every conversation. Devil became the ultimate trump card. You can't argue with it, you can't question it, because the accusation itself is the proof. Once someone's branded a servant of Satan, reason stops mattering. That's how entire populations were silenced, by turning words into weapons. The most chilling part? The church didn't even need to believe its own rhetoric. It knew exactly what it was doing. Bishops and inquisitors weren't theologians, they were administrators. They saw religion as infrastructure. The devil was a management tool, a convenient scapegoat to keep the hierarchy functioning. When a village rebelled, call it possession. When a thinker challenged doctrine, call it heresy. When a woman defied patriarchy, call it witchcraft. No investigation needed. Just ritualize the punishment and call it justice. Every power system needs an enemy to justify its existence. The Roman Empire had the barbarians. The medieval church had the devil. It's the same psychology: without fear, authority collapses. The devil gave the church an infinite enemy. A villain that could never be defeated, only managed, conveniently, through them. The priest became the gatekeeper of salvation, the exorcist, the protector. The church positioned itself as humanity's only defense against a monster it invented. The brilliance of the design is almost diabolical. They didn't just weaponize fear, they moneized it. Holy water, relics, pilgrimages, indulgences, all part of a spiritual economy built around the idea that you're never safe. The devil was the advertising campaign. The church was the product. And because the product was invisible, it could never be disproven. If you questioned the system, that was the devil speaking through you. If you obeyed, it was grace. A perfect self-sealing loop. By the time the Renaissance arrived, the framework was so deeply embedded that artists, kings, and scholars couldn't escape it. Even the so-called reformers who tried to purify Christianity kept the same binary structure: God versus Satan. They just changed the management. That's how effective the original programming was. It transcended politics, language, and reform. Once humanity accepted the idea of a single absolute evil, the church didn't need to be in the room anymore. The fear ran on autopilot. Let's close this chapter by exposing the core of the illusion: how the devil as we know him today isn't a supernatural truth but a manufactured artifact. A tool. A system built across centuries through language, imagery, fear, and control. You've seen how Pan's horns became Satan's crown, how Lucifer went from morning star to eternal enemy, how art, architecture, and law turned mythology into doctrine. But the real trick, the masterstroke, is how that invention survived every reform, every empire, every new translation of the Bible. Because the church didn't just create a devil, it built an operating system for civilization. The devil became the code that kept obedience running, long after the architects were gone. When Christianity moved from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, Europe was shifting. Printing presses, humanism, science, discovery, all of it threatened to crack the monopoly of religious control. But the image of the devil adapted. It evolved like a virus. It became psychological. The same system that once burned witches began to burn ideas. Scholars who questioned the cosmos were accused of consorting with infernal powers. Giordano Bruno was executed in 1600 not because he worshipped Satan, but because he dared to describe an infinite universe that didn't need a divine jailer. His crime was heresy, code for intellectual independence. Every mind that broke the script became a new battlefield in the Church's invisible war against its own creation. You can trace how the devil morphed with the times. In the Reformation, Protestants and Catholics accused each other of being the true servants of Satan. Luther called the Pope the Antichrist. Rome labeled the Reformers demonic heretics. Two factions of the same faith, both invoking the same villain. It shows how deep the control mechanism went. Once you have a universal enemy, anyone can wear the mask. The devil became the blank check of accusation, the ultimate political weapon. No evidence required. Just say the name, and every mind shuts down. In colonial times, the same template was exported to every continent. Missionaries marched into Africa, the Americas, Asia, and labeled indigenous gods as demons. It was spiritual imperialism disguised as salvation. You can still see it in records from the Spanish conquests. Aztec temples burned, their gods renamed as devils, their rituals rewritten as satanic sacrifices. The Church told the conquered people that their pain was proof of possession, that only baptism could save them. They took the devil global. That's how a Mediterranean myth became a world law. Then came the Enlightenment, the age of reason, logic, and science. You'd think that would have killed the superstition, right? Wrong. It just changed form. The Church lost some control, but the concept of the devil was too profitable to die. It moved into the culture. Writers, painters, philosophers, they all used the image as shorthand for rebellion, temptation, or genius. Milton's Paradise Lost turned Lucifer into a tragic anti-hero. Goethe's Faust made him the broker of ambition. The devil became marketable. From theology, he crossed into entertainment. Fear had evolved into narrative currency. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the devil wasn't just a threat, he was a brand. Churches still preached fire and brimstone, but the image of Satan started showing up in operas, novels, and art salons. He went from destroyer to symbol of defiance, of forbidden knowledge. That's how the Church's weapon backfired. The same myth that was meant to enslave became a symbol of rebellion for those who dared to think. The elites, the occultists, the free thinkers, they all saw through the manipulation and started using the imagery of the devil as satire. If the Church called reason demonic, fine, then knowledge itself became the forbidden fruit worth biting again. Still, the fear didn't vanish. It just moved underground, into subconscious conditioning. Even today, people raised in Christian-majority societies feel instinctive guilt over doubt, curiosity, sexuality, or freedom. That's not coincidence. That's centuries of programming. The devil became the label for everything outside control. The message was clear: obey, or the devil owns you. It was never about a being, it was about a behavioral algorithm. Once fear is embedded deep enough, the system runs itself. Look at how the imagery persisted into modern times. During the Industrial Revolution, as machines replaced miracles, religious authorities warned that scientific progress was satanic. Electricity, evolution, psychology, each new discovery was branded of the devil at first. Darwin's theory? Satan's deception. Freud's study of the mind? Satan's intrusion into the soul. Even cinema, when it first appeared, was condemned as a demonic illusion. The same formula that worked in medieval Europe just got updated for new technology. The devil became the label for every challenge to authority. By the 20th century, organized religion no longer had the monopoly, but the architecture of fear still shaped the culture. Politicians used it, ideologies used it, even Hollywood used it. The devil became an industry. From The Exorcist to Rosemary's Baby, the image of evil went mainstream. Every scream sold tickets, every possession sold faith. It's the same mechanism, control through terror, but now packaged for entertainment. The Church had planted the myth so deeply that even atheists were buying into it emotionally. They didn't believe in the devil, but they still felt him. That's the ultimate victory of propaganda when disbelief doesn't free you. There's another layer people rarely talk about, the economic side of morality. By the 20th century, entire industries revolved around policing evil. Book bans, censorship boards, moral committees, anti-communist purges, all of them borrowed the same theological template. Replace Satan with subversive and the machinery's identical. You accuse, isolate, and destroy under the banner of righteousness. The ghost of the devil still powered the system. Even now, look around. The concept still lives. Politicians weaponize it every election cycle. Media outlets invoke it in moral panics, video games, rock music, artificial intelligence. Every new threat gets baptized in fire. The names change, but the structure doesn't. The devil's genius isn't that he tempts humanity, it's that humanity keeps resurrecting him to justify fear. Every generation builds its own version because fear is profitable and guilt is easy to sell. But there's an irony the church never foresaw. By creating a universal villain, they exposed their own need for control. The myth of the devil reveals more about power than it does about evil. Every ruler, every priest, every institution that's ever needed blind obedience borrowed that same architecture: invent chaos, promise order, and rule the middle ground. The devil is the original template for authoritarian psychology. Once you understand that, every moral panic looks like a rerun. Let's go deeper into how the concept sustained its power through ritual. The church turned the devil into the engine of confession. You weren't just asked to admit your sins, you were trained to imagine that invisible hands were whispering them into your mind. The devil was the excuse for every human impulse that didn't serve authority. Anger? Temptation? Doubt? Possession? Curiosity? Deception? That constant externalization of blame kept people from ever confronting the real mechanism: control. It was the perfect trap. You could never question the system without being accused of serving its enemy. You can see the psychological aftermath everywhere. Even secular societies built on logic still inherit the binary: good versus evil, light versus darkness, order versus chaos. The language of morality remains dualistic because the church's myth became cultural software. You don't need to believe in hell to act like it's watching. That's how deep the conditioning runs. The devil outlived his creators because humanity internalized the architecture of fear. The church designed a myth, and the myth became self-aware. Through time, every institution that needed control learned from that model. Governments use it, corporations use it, media uses it. Create an enemy, amplify the fear, then present yourself as the savior. That's not theology, it's social engineering. The medieval priests used hellfire, modern systems use security threats, ideologies, conspiracies. Different names, same structure. The devil was the prototype. And here's the historical irony. The very traits the church condemned as satanic, curiosity, autonomy, defiance, sensuality, are the same forces that fueled the Renaissance, science, and modern civilization. The so-called demonic impulse to question authority built the world we live in. The same energy they called evil is what broke the chains. That's the final twist of this entire story. The devil they warned you about is the shadow of your own intelligence. The part they couldn't domesticate. The part they needed to scare you away from so you'd never realize how much power you actually have. The myth of the devil began as a tool for domination, evolved into global folklore, and eventually became the cultural foundation of how humanity defines fear itself. It's not about horns or fire, it's about control. Every century reprogrammed him, every empire gave him a new mask, but the function never changed. He's not the ruler of hell. He's the mirror of every system that rules through fear. And that's why this history matters. Because once you understand how that mask was built, layer by layer, lie by lie, you can finally see how deep the manipulation went. You can trace every moral panic, every crusade, every holy war back to the same origin, the invention of an enemy that never existed until it was profitable. Thank you for staying with me through this deep dive. If you've made it this far, you've walked through 2,000 years of human storytelling, politics, and psychological engineering. The devil isn't hiding under the floorboards, he's hiding in plain sight, in the systems, in the language, in the conditioning. You've seen how it all started, how it evolved, and how it still runs today. I appreciate you for listening, for questioning, and for not turning away from the uncomfortable truth. Thanks for watching, and for thinking.